Have you ever wondered how much beauty is truly worth? Throughout human history, there have been beauty standards that make us shudder when we look back. One such standard is the tradition of footbinding, or lotus feet, in China, a practice that lasted for over 1,000 years, from the 10th century to the early 20th century. Imagine, young girls, only 4 or 5 years old, forced to endure excruciating pain as the bones in their feet were broken, just to achieve tiny feet measuring less than 10 centimeters, something considered a symbol of beauty and social status. But what lies behind this beauty? Tears, infected wounds, and an entire life stripped of freedom. I chose this topic not only out of curiosity about a unique custom in Chinese history, but also because it made me question, are we today chasing similarly absurd beauty standards, just as the Chinese did with footbinding? In this article, I will take you through the journey of footbinding, its origins, execution, meaning, impact, and its eventual end. Moreover, I aim to draw lessons from the past to reflect on our present. Let's begin.
Let's travel back to the 10th century during the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period in China, a time of chaos but also filled with legendary stories. According to a famous legend, footbinding originated from a consort of Emperor Li Huzhu
Of the Southern Tang dynasty. It is said that to please the emperor, she tightly bound her feet, wrapping them in cloth to form a crescent moon shape, and then danced on a golden lotus flower. Her small feet, about 3 inches long, around 10 centimeters, were compared to lotus feet, a symbol of grace and allure. The emperor was captivated, and from then on, small feet became a symbol of beauty among the aristocracy. But do you know what this beautiful legend led to? It marked the beginning of a cruel tradition that lasted more than 1,000 years, affecting millions of Chinese women. From the aristocracy, footbinding quickly spread. By the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279, it became an indispensable beauty standard among the elite. During the Yuan, 1271 to 1368, and Ming, 1368-1644 dynasties, this custom was no longer exclusive to the upper class. It had infiltrated the middle class and even peasants. By the Qing dynasty, 1644-1912, footbinding reached its peak, with millions of young girls across China forced to endure this painful process. But what made such a cruel tradition persist for so long? The answer lies in the cultural and societal context of the time. Footbinding was reinforced by Confucianism, which emphasized the 3 obediences and 4 virtues, meaning women were to obey their father, husband, and son while maintaining virtues such as propriety, speech, demeanor, and work. In this mindset, small feet were seen as a symbol of obedience and virtue, as they made it difficult for women to walk, thus making them dependent on their families and unable to participate in outdoor activities. Additionally, literature and poetry of the time glorified footbinding. For example, a poet from the Song dynasty wrote, 3-inch lotus feet, walking like clouds, she passes by and my heart is lost. Such praises made small feet an irreplaceable beauty standard and put immense pressure on women. Personally, I shudder when I think of a young girl enduring such pain just to meet society's expectations. But what's even scarier is that for over 1,000 years no one dared to speak out to change it, until the first voices of protest emerged in the late 19th century. If you think that footbinding was simply about wrapping cloth around the feet, you're mistaken. It was a brutal process, lasting many years, filled with unimaginable pain. Let's delve into the details, but I warn you, what you're about to hear might make you feel heartbroken. Typically, girls began footbinding between the ages of 4 and 7, when their bones were still soft and easy to manipulate. This age was chosen not by chance. Young children could endure the pain better, and their bones had not yet fully developed, making them more malleable. The process began with soaking the feet in warm water or herbal medicine to soften the skin and bones. Then, the mother, or sometimes the grandmother, would cut the toenails of the child and bend the toes, except the big toe, down to the sole of the foot, creating a crescent shape. To maintain this shape, a cloth strip about 3 to 5 meters long was wrapped tightly around the feet, restricting blood flow. This process didn't happen just once, but over the years. Every few days the cloth would be removed for cleaning and then re-wrapped tighter, making the feet smaller and smaller. The pain during this process is indescribable. Many young girls screamed, and some even fainted from the agony. One woman, who underwent footbinding, Mrs. Zhao Shihua, born in 1905, recalled in her memoirs, "I remember those first nights. My feet hurt so much that I couldn't sleep. I begged my mother to take the cloth off, but she just cried and said that if I didn't do this, I wouldn't be able to get married and our family would be ashamed." Her words show that not only did they suffer physical pain, but they also bore a psychological burden. They didn't just endure the agony, they felt they had no choice but to comply. The complications of footbinding were severe. Infections were inevitable, as the feet were tightly wrapped for prolonged periods without proper hygiene. In some cases, infections led to necrosis, requiring the amputation of toes or even death. According to modern medical studies, women who had undergone footbinding often experienced spinal deformities, chronic pain, and a higher risk of osteoporosis due to lack of movement. The end result was tiny feet, usually measuring 7 to 10 centimeters long, known as Lotus feet. These feet were praised in Chinese poetry and literature, but the price paid was a lifetime of pain and restriction. I can't help but wonder, how could a society accept the torture of children just to meet a beauty standard? As a person living in the modern age, I feel both sorrow and anger when I think about the young girls who had to endure this. But perhaps what's most terrifying is that, for centuries, no one dared to stand up and say, "This is wrong." Now that we understand the process of footbinding, you might ask, why did the Chinese consider small feet beautiful? And more importantly, how did this custom affect women and Chinese society? Let's explore. In Confucian China, small feet were not just a symbol of beauty, but also a sign of grace, femininity, and allure. It was believed that women with small feet walked delicately, showing weakness and the need for protection, qualities that were highly valued in a patriarchal society. Moreover, small feet were seen as a ticket for women to elevate their social status. A girl with lotus feet was more likely to marry into a wealthy family, bringing prestige and prosperity to her family. However, footbinding was not uniformly practiced across all regions of China. In the north, where people primarily worked in agriculture, footbinding was less common, as women needed to walk and labor in the fields. In contrast, in the southern regions, particularly in wealthy areas like Jiangnan, footbinding was more widely practiced, as these areas were home to the elite and officials. This regional difference shows that footbinding was not just a cultural issue, but also reflected the class and economic divisions within Chinese society. Physically, the impact of footbinding was devastating. Women who had bound feet could not walk normally. They had to move slowly, wobble, and often required assistance. Many suffered chronic pain throughout their lives due to deformed feet and spines. Psychologically, the societal pressure was unbearable. Another woman, Mrs. Li Shihua, born in 1890, wrote in her diary, "I hate my feet. Every step is a pain, but I dare not speak out because if I don't bind my feet, I'll be considered useless, unworthy to be a wife." Her words reveal that the pain was not just physical, but emotional. The fear of being rejected by society if they didn't conform to the standard. The impact of footbinding was not just personal, but also had a profound effect on Chinese society. It reinforced the patriarchal mindset, reducing women to mere decorative objects in their families, incapable of labor or participating in public life. Economically, This reduced the productivity of families and society, as women, half of the population, could not work efficiently. But what saddens me most is that, for centuries, footbinding was celebrated in poetry, art, and literature, as if the pain of millions of women never existed. Personally, I believe footbinding was not just a custom, but also a symbol of the oppression of women in feudal society. It reminds us that when a society imposes unreasonable beauty standards, the ones who suffer the most are the most vulnerable, women and young girls. But every tradition, no matter how cruel, eventually comes to an end. By the late 19th century, voices of protest against footbinding began to emerge, and surprisingly, they didn't just come from the Chinese but from foreigners as well. Do you know who was among the first to speak out? It was Western missionaries who came to China in the 19th century to spread Christianity. Upon witnessing the suffering of Chinese women due to footbinding, they called it a barbaric practice that violated human rights and ethics. Their voices awakened some Chinese reformers, such as Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, who began advocating for the abolition of this custom. A movement called the Natural Foot Society, Tiantu Hui, was established, encouraging women to abandon footbinding and embrace natural feet. But the change didn't only come from abroad. Within Chinese society, many internal factors also contributed to the weakening of footbinding. The rise of education, particularly for women, helped them realize their rights. The press, such as the Shenbao newspaper, began publishing articles criticizing footbinding as an outdated custom. The May 4th movement of 1919, with its democratic and scientific spirit, also played a crucial role in changing societal attitudes. Chinese women, particularly those involved in revolutionary movements like the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, began demanding gender equality and rejecting oppressive beauty standards. In 1912, after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the Republic of China officially banned footbinding. This was a historic turning point, marking the end of a practice that had lasted more than 1,000 years. However, enforcing this ban was not easy. In many rural areas, footbinding continued to exist quietly until the mid-20th century, as people were still bound by outdated thinking and societal pressures. The aftermath of footbinding's decline is also worth pondering. The women who had undergone footbinding, now grown or elderly, had to face the painful reality that their feet were permanently deformed, unable to return to normal. Many felt lost in a society that was changing, where natural feet were gradually being accepted as the new standard of beauty. However, the positive outcome was that the abolition of footbinding opened a new era for Chinese women. Thanks to education and feminist movements, they began to recognize their worth and no longer had to be bound by oppressive standards. I deeply admire the reformers who stood up to change a practice that had been ingrained in Chinese culture. They not only freed women from physical pain, but also paved the way for gender equality. But at the same time, I can't help but feel sorrow for the generations of women who had to endure footbinding for centuries. Now that we look back on footbinding, what lessons can we learn? And more importantly, what does this practice mean in today's context? Let's reflect. The first and most important lesson is about beauty standards. Footbinding shows us that when a society imposes unreasonable beauty standards, the ones who pay the price are always the most vulnerable. Millions of Chinese women suffered physical pain and lost their freedom just to meet societal expectations. This makes me wonder, are we today following similar beauty standards? In South Korea, often referred to as the cosmetic surgery capital of the world, statistics show that over 50% of women in their 20s and 30s have undergone at least one cosmetic surgery, such as eyelid surgery, nose jobs, or jaw reshaping. On social media, the pressure to look a certain way has only intensified, with apps like Me Too or FaceApp causing many to feel inadequate without flawless skin, large eyes, or a perfect body. Could these pressures be the footbinding of the modern age? The second lesson is about gender equality. Footbinding is a clear example of the injustice faced by women in feudal society. It reminds us that gender equality is not something inherent, but the result of ongoing struggle. The end of footbinding shows the power of education and social reform. When women have access to knowledge, they begin to realize their worth and demand their rights. The international community also had noteworthy reactions to footbinding. In addition to Western missionaries, international feminist organizations, such as the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, spoke out against footbinding in the early 20th century, viewing it as a symbol of women's oppression. Western scholars like anthropologist Margaret Mead also studied and wrote about footbinding, emphasizing that it was not just an issue for China, but a global lesson about the dangers of cultural oppression. In the modern context, footbinding remains a cultural legacy worth studying. It helps us better understand Chinese history and serves as a warning about the societal pressures that women still face today. As someone living in the present, I believe we must continue to fight against oppressive beauty standards and build a society where everyone is loved and respected for who they are, not just for how they look. The tradition of footbinding in China is a painful but meaningful chapter in human history. From its origins in the 10th century, when a consort danced on a golden lotus flower, to its painful execution, profound impact on women and society, and eventual abolition in the early 20th century, this 1,000-year journey of footbinding leaves us with many valuable lessons. It reminds us of the importance of gender equality, the dangers of unreasonable beauty standards, and the power of education to change society. As someone living in the present, I cannot help but feel grateful that we have overcome such cruel customs. But at the same time, I remind myself that we still have a long way to go to ensure that no one must endure pain just to meet society's expectations. I hope that after hearing the story of footbinding, you will take the time to learn more about Chinese history and culture and join me in supporting gender equality movements around the world. True beauty lies not in outward appearances, but in the freedom and happiness of every individual.